This is Dan, aka Entertainment WF, aka Page Wizard, aka Blah. On this edition of Dan Says, I want to talk about the phrase, well, my logic says blank. Now, this saying is rather popular, especially with people that are maybe a little less educated on the idea of what logic is. So, I thought I would have a fun little chat about this with you. So, if you're here still, I assume that you are here to listen to me. Anyways, so when somebody says to you, hey, you have some pretty good logic, or my logic says blank, what exactly do they mean? Well, they're trying to say, well, my reason for something so and so and so and so is blank. Now, the problem with this saying is that your reasoning it could have absolutely nothing to do with logic to begin with. And the fact that you can have your own logic is the fact that you have to lay down what you're going to be talking about before you can even say anything about it. For example, if I said my logic is propositional logic, then that means that I have to work within that logical system. I can't just go and jump hoops around it, or I can't just say something that inherently contradicts propositional logic. For example, if I throw a liar statement at it, or maybe a potential tautology, I can't really say too much about it. It's like that. It's just, you can't really say a whole lot. So, when it comes down to it, propositions really can take different turns based on what you're trying to say. So, when somebody says, my logic is blank, the first question you should ask them is, what is your logic to begin with? What is your logic? What logical system are you using? What are the rules of your system? What is your logical system? If you say that you are using a logic, you must be implying that you are using some form of reasoning based on some sort of things called axioms. And you at home will say axioms, okay? So 1, 2, 3, axioms. So you'll be using axioms. Axioms are a set of rules that must be inherently true within that system, or else they would form an inconsistency. Number 2, it must form things called rules. Say rules. These things, rules. Unlike axioms, rules are things that are connecting the connectives of things called terms. Say terms. Terms between, say, given statements between the axioms. So sometimes logical systems will use axioms and rules disjointly. But at best, honestly, axioms and rules are very highly linked to each other, and thus on that point, let's see, next question would say, well, what kind of terms, what kind of statements can we talk about in your logic? Fundamentally, this means that your system must adhere to the rules of your system. Now, the problem with this in particular is that, hey, I can invent any logical system aside from the fact that I have inherent laws and logic that I can't break. Like for example, I can never prove all of arithmetic within a logical system. It would be inconsistent or incomplete. Always. No matter what. No, even if you assert it's true, you can never actually prove it using some systematic steps. So, i.e. some sort of magical proof-making machine. That's my own discourse and theory. Anyways, so back to this idea. This idea of people saying, oh, my logic is blank. Well, the very first thing, after you ask them what are these bunch of these things, the next thing is, well, if they didn't give you something, say, much more formal and concrete, so you can, say, analyze the statements in their formal system, well, let's take it one step further. Let's say, hey, well, if your logic says this particular thing, well, what about that? Like, find something that you can throw a wrench into with it. Find something that you can just say, hey, I'm going to take this pen, I'm going to shove it right into your logical system. Just go, wham! Just wham the thing, just whoosh! Yeah. So, the idea, and that's what mathematicians and theoretical computer scientists do a lot of, is you take an idea, much like any scientist would do, and you try to break it. Usually that's a very strong discourse of mathematics, And this idea of logic, because logic is a mathematical construct. It isn't some sort of hooky thing that you get to say is true or say a bunch of hooky things about. It's something very concrete. Like I said, there's axioms. These things are forms, things constructed by terms and rules that you lay out before you can say anything about them. And next to the next point, you can ask them, well, how useful is your logic? Humans are naturally subjective. They aren't objective naturally. They will perceive things naturally by their rules, based on what they see, what they hear, what they taste, what they touch, and all other things in their senses. With that in mind, what and why should I consider your logic so relevant if you can't even lay it down? And likewise, if you can't even perceive it properly. Most people that say this phrase typically don't understand what logic is to begin with. So, once you got to this step, they're probably pretty frustrated with you, because they think, oh, you're attacking them, because they apparently aren't allowed to reason things. Well, the thing is, they're allowed to reason things. That's what opinions are good for, but they have to do it critically. And how do you do it critically? You append it to something useful, say a formal system, or some evidence, or some empirical or formal constructs. Logic is a great formal construct. There's many things you can't do with logic. But logic is a very powerful tool. Say, heck on this machine, for example. This idea of having, say, my logic is blank, really can say, hey, what the heck is up with this? Why are you saying logic? Logic is not something humans are naturally programmed to do. They are things that, no matter how hard you try, they aren't things that are opinion-based. Sure, there are always debates about particular logical systems. These are typically called philosophical logics, because they do not have formal constructs, they don't have axioms usually, and they usually follow rules that don't naturally fit within mathematics. So, for example, things about many world systems or interpretations can be things that are considered much more of a philosophical thing rather than a mathematical thing. Does it make them less useful? Potentially, yes. But we're talking about logic here. This should be black and white, black and white. And people usually attack others for saying, hey, your logic is black and white. Well, mine isn't. Well, no. Axioms are things that have to be inherently true when you apply them down. You can't make assumptions that are far too far from what you can say perceives in reality. So thus far, let's continue. Let's take it one step further. So, my logic is blank. Well, I just basically told you that if you just invent an arbitrary system, it's less likely that it's going to be one that's actually going to be useful for your reason to begin with. Thus, I don't care what your logical system or what you think logic is. If you understand what logic is, you would just apply logic. You don't need to say my logic, because most likely your logic is not very useful. Because it probably doesn't have axioms, it probably doesn't have rules, it doesn't probably investigate anything. It probably doesn't have some sort of scope to it. Logics have typically scopes to them, what statements they can't talk about, what things they can talk about. What you're referring to is intuition. Intuition to infer things. These are things that are not inherently logic. They are things that you have to actually understand and use your gut feeling to understand. You can call it like the gut knowledge. Say my gut was like, woof, well, like that. You'd have a big gut feeling there. Anyways. I just wanted to talk about that. I found it interesting, because I find it, especially with people that are very relativistic, or people that assume that there are more than one truth. You're wrong. Thank you.